Tim, this never happened on a Friday, and it did not happen on the day of Passover. Darian, wait, what are you talking about? The crucifixion is the most documented event in antiquity. Tim, the event, yes. The day? They changed it. Darian, changed it? Who changed it? Tim, the author of the Gospel of John. He moved the death of Jesus to an entirely different day. Malcolm, and the problem is not just that he moved it, the problem is why. Tim, exactly. If you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are perfectly clear. Jesus eats the Passover meal. The Last Supper is the Passover. He is crucified the next day. Darian, right. That is what every church in the world teaches. That is what everyone learns. Tim, but John? John says the Last Supper was just a regular meal and that Jesus was crucified the next day before the Passover had even begun. Darian, so they contradict each other? Malcolm, they do more than contradict. They provide two mutually exclusive timelines for the single most important event in the history of the Christian faith. Tim, you cannot have both. If Matthew is right, John is wrong. If John is right, Matthew is wrong. And they knew exactly what they were doing. Darian, I have been reading these texts my entire life. I have never seen this. Malcolm, because we are taught to read them vertically. You read Matthew from start to finish. Then you read Mark, then Luke, then John. You read them in isolation, and when you do that, the narrative feels perfectly seamless. It feels like one continuous, flawless historical record. Tim, but that is not how history works. If you want to know what actually happened, you have to read them horizontally, side by side, event by event. Darian, okay, let us do that. Show me the exact texts, because this feels like a massive leap. You are claiming an intentional alteration. Show me the evidence. Tim, all right, let us look at the Synoptic Gospels first. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark chapter 14, verse 12. It says, on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover? Malcolm, the text is incredibly specific. The disciples are asking about the Passover meal. Jesus gives them instructions. They go to a room. They prepare the meal. They sit down and eat it together. This is what we call the Last Supper. Darian, yes. And during that meal, he breaks the bread. He shares the cup. It is the foundation of the Eucharist. It is a Passover meal. Tim, exactly. Mark says it. Matthew repeats it in chapter 26. Luke repeats it in chapter 22. They are absolutely unified on this timeline. Jesus eats the Passover meal on Thursday evening. He is arrested that night. He is put on trial the next morning. And he is crucified that day, the day of Passover. Darian, okay, that is the established timeline. It makes perfect sense. Where is the problem? Tim, the problem is the Gospel of John. Malcolm, when you open John, the entire chronology shifts. John chapter 13 describes the Last Supper, but John adds a very specific chronological marker right at the beginning. He says, it was just before the Passover festival. Darian, just before, not during? Tim, not during. John says the Last Supper was not a Passover meal. It was just a normal meal on the day before. Darian, wait, maybe just before is just a figure of speech. Maybe John is talking about the specific moment before they started eating. Malcolm, that is what many apologists try to argue. Craig Blomberg, for example, in his book The Historical Reliability of the Gospels, published in 1987, provides the conservative scholarly defense. He suggests that John and the Synoptics might have been using different calendrical reckonings, perhaps a solar calendar versus a lunar calendar, or differing definitions of the word Passover. Darian. That sounds reasonable. In the first century, terms were fluid. Different communities tracked time differently, so John's preparation day might just mean the Friday of the Passover week, not the day before the meal itself. Tim. That is a very comforting explanation. It allows you to keep the belief that the Bible is perfectly consistent. The only problem is that the Gospel of John itself completely destroys that explanation. Darian, how? Tim. Because John does not just mention it once, he makes it the central focus of his entire passion narrative. Look at John chapter 18, verse 28. Jesus has been arrested. He is taken to Pilate, and the Jewish leaders refuse to enter Pilate's palace. Do you know why? Malcolm. The text says they refused to enter the Gentile palace because they wanted to avoid ceremonial uncleanness. Why? Because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Tim. They had not eaten it yet. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, everyone has already eaten the Passover meal the night before. But in John, on the morning of the trial, the Jewish leaders are still waiting to eat it. Darian, are you sure? Could they be talking about a different meal during the festival week? Tim, look at John chapter 19, verse 14. Pilate brings Jesus out to be judged, and John gives us the exact day and time. He writes, "It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon." Malcolm, the day of preparation. That is the day when all the lambs are slaughtered in the temple. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is crucified at 9 in the morning on the day of Passover. In John, he is standing before Pilate at noon on the day of preparation. They are 24 hours apart. Darian, that is impossible. They cannot both be true. Malcolm, they cannot. And they are not. E.P. Sanders, in his 1993 work, The Historical Figure of Jesus, discusses these chronological issues extensively. He concludes that the synoptic timeline of the Last Supper as a Passover meal is historically more probable. Tim, which means John changed it. He intentionally moved the day of the crucifixion. Darian, but why would anyone do that? Why would an author writing about the most sacred event in his religion deliberately alter the historical date? What is there to gain? Tim, everything. He gained everything. Because John was not writing history. He was writing theology. And to make his theology work, he needed Jesus to die at a very specific hour. Darian, a specific hour? What are we talking about here? Malcolm. To understand this, you have to picture what Jerusalem was like on the day of preparation. It was not a quiet religious observance. It was a massive, bloody spectacle. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of pilgrims flooded into the city, and every single family had to bring a lamb to the temple to be sacrificed for the Passover meal. Timan. Picture the scene. The Temple Mount is packed. The priests are standing in lines holding gold and silver basins. The lambs are slaughtered. The blood is caught in the basins, and the priests pass them down the line to be splashed against the altar. It was a continuous, deafening, visceral process that started at noon and went until the evening. Malcolm, that is the day of preparation. That is the day before the Passover meal. And that is exactly when John places Jesus on the cross. Darian. So you are saying John looked at that spectacle, that massive theological symbol of the Lamb dying to save the people, and decided Jesus had to be part of it? Tim, not just part of it, the culmination of it. But there was a problem. The historical tradition, the one preserved in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, said Jesus was crucified the next day, after the lambs were already dead, after the meal had already been eaten. Malcolm, John could not have that. If Jesus dies on Friday, the day of Passover, he is just a martyr dying on a holy day. If he dies on Thursday, the day of preparation, he is the theological replacement for the temple sacrifice itself. Darian, and John just changed it? He just moved the date? How did he expect to get away with that? Everyone else was writing a different story. Tim, he got away with it because in the first century they were not cross-referencing Gospels. These texts were circulating in different communities. John's community in Ephesus might not have been reading Mark's Gospel. They were reading their own text, and their text needed a Passover lamb. Malcolm E.P. Sanders points out that the Synoptic timeline, the one where Jesus eats the Last Supper as a Passover meal, is overwhelmingly more historically probable. It fits the established customs, it fits the chronology of the week, and it fits the actions of the disciples. John's timeline is the outlier. It is the one that breaks the historical mold. Malcolm, and here is where the conversation changes level. Darian, I need to understand this. You are saying the author of John looked at the established historical timeline, the one recorded by Mark and Matthew, and decided to rewrite it on purpose? Tim, not just on purpose, with surgical precision. He needed to align the death of Jesus with something very specific. Malcolm Raymond E. Brown, in his monumental 1994 work, The Death of the Messiah, analyses the differing chronologies of the Passion narratives. He points out something fascinating about John's timeline. In John, Jesus is standing before Pilate at noon on the day of preparation. Do you know what happens in Jerusalem at the exact moment the sun hits noon on the day of preparation? Darian, that is when the festival preparations begin. Tim, no. It is when the priests begin slaughtering the Passover lambs in the temple. Darian, wait, Malcolm. The timing is not a coincidence. It is an editorial masterpiece. By moving the day of the crucifixion back by 24 hours, John ensures that Jesus is hung on the cross at the exact same hour that the paschal lambs are being slaughtered for the Passover meal. Tim, in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus eats the Passover lamb. In John, Jesus is the Passover lamb. And to make that metaphor work, John had to alter the historical date of his death. Darian, okay, I have to admit that this data is strong. The symbolic alignment is undeniable, but this does not prove malicious intent. Perhaps John was just emphasizing a theological truth. Tim, emphasizing? He literally deleted the Last Supper as a Passover meal. He scrubbed it from the timeline. He broke the historical record to create a theological symbol. Malcolm, I remember standing at the front of a lecture hall in Durham. I was teaching a module on New Testament chronology. I had drawn the two timelines on the board, Mark's timeline on the left, John's timeline on the right. And I just stepped back. I did not say anything. I just watched the room. You could always tell the exact moment it hit them. The quiet distress, the shifting in their seats. These were students who had spent their whole lives in church, celebrating Holy Week every year, and no one had ever shown them that the book they were holding gave two mutually exclusive days for the very event their faith was built upon. Darian, that is deeply uncomfortable, but continues. Because if this is true, the implications are staggering. Tim: Oh, they are worse than staggering. Think about what this means. If an author is willing to change the day of the most important event in history just to fit a theological narrative, what else did they change? Darian: That is a dangerous question. Malcolm: It is the only question that matters. When you realize that the gospel writers were not acting as modern journalists, but as theological editors, the entire foundation shifts. They were not trying to preserve a pristine historical record. They were trying to make a point. Tim: And John's point was that Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice. He is the only gospel writer who calls Jesus the Lamb of God. John chapter 1 verse 29. Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. John plants that seed in chapter 1 and he fulfills it in chapter 19 by altering the timeline of the crucifixion. Darian's I do not have a good answer for this. It is one thing to say there are minor discrepancies like how many angels were at the tomb, but the day of the crucifixion, the timeline of the Last Supper, these are the linchpins of the faith. Malcolm: Exactly. And this is not a new debate. The early church fought over this bitterly. It was called the Quartodeciman controversy. In the 2nd century, Christians in Asia Minor celebrated Easter on the 14th of Nisan, the exact day of Passover, following the Gospel of John. But Christians in Rome celebrated it on a Sunday, following the Synoptic tradition. They excommunicated each other over this very discrepancy. Tim: Because they knew it mattered. They knew the timelines were irreconcilable. Modern apologists try to harmonize them. They say, oh, John was using Roman civil time where the day begins at midnight, so the 6th hour was actually 6 in the morning. Darian: I have heard that argument, that Mark used Jewish time, so his 3rd hour was 9 in the morning, and John used Roman time, so his 6th hour was 6 in the morning. That resolves the conflict, doesn't it? Tim: It resolves nothing. Because even if you play mathematical gymnastics with the hours of the day, you cannot change the fact that John explicitly places the trial on the day of preparation, the day before the Passover meal. The Synoptics explicitly place it on the day of Passover, the day after the meal. You cannot harmonize 24 hours of historical reality. Malcolm and Bart D. Ehrman, in his 2009 book, Jesus Interrupted, demonstrates this irreconcilable chronological discrepancy perfectly. He argues unequivocally that John altered the synoptic timeline for theological symbolism. It was not a mistake. It was a conscious editorial decision. Darian, I came into this conversation thinking I knew how to defend the text, that the timeline was settled. I did not know this. Tim: No one wants you to know this, because the moment you see the seams in the text, you start wondering who stitched it together and why. Malcolm: And this brings us to the core of the issue. The real problem is not that John changed the date. The real problem is what that change reveals about the nature of the Bible itself. Darian: What does it reveal? Tim: That it is managed, constructed, that the theology overrode the history. Malcolm: To understand just how managed this text really is, you have to look at what John did to the Last Supper itself. It is not just that he moved the day. It is what he deleted from the meal. Darian deleted? What did he delete? Tim: The Eucharist, the communion, the very foundation of the Christian liturgy. Darian: Wait, that cannot be right. The Last Supper in John is famous. He washes the disciples' feet. He gives the long farewell discourse. Malcolm: Yes, he washes their feet. But look closely at the text of John chapter 13. Jesus never breaks the bread. He never shares the cup. He never says, "This is my body, given for you." The institution of the Lord's Supper, which is the climax of the meal in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is completely missing from the Gospel of John. Darian: why would John leave out the most important ritual in the Christian faith? Tim: because he had to. Think about the timeline. In the Synoptics, the Last Supper is a Passover meal. The bread represents the unleavened bread of Passover. The wine represents the blood of the Passover lamb. The symbolism works perfectly. But John moved the meal to Thursday, the day before Passover. Malcolm: if John included the Eucharist on Thursday, he would be having Jesus institute a Passover ritual before the Passover lambs had even been slaughtered. The theology would clash. So, John made a brutal editorial choice. To preserve his timeline where Jesus dies as the lamb on Friday, he completely erased the Eucharist from the Last Supper on Thursday. Darian: that is staggering. He fundamentally altered the narrative of the most sacred night in Jesus' life just to make his Friday timeline work. Tim: exactly. He traded the Eucharist for the washing of the feet, all so he could keep Jesus on the cross at noon on Friday. It is an editorial masterstroke, but it is devastating for anyone who believes the Gospels are independent, historically accurate eyewitness accounts. Malcolm: and this editorial choice caused absolute chaos in the early church. We mentioned the Quartodeciman controversy briefly, but you have to understand the scale of the conflict. The word Quartodeciman comes from the Latin for 14th. It refers to the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, the day of Passover. Tim: in the late 2nd century, the churches in Asia Minor, led by a bishop named Polycrates, insisted on celebrating the crucifixion on the 14th of Nisan. Why? Because they followed the Gospel of John. They believed Jesus was the Passover lamb, sacrificed on the exact day. Malcolm: but the church in Rome, led by Bishop Victor, followed the Synoptic tradition. They insisted on celebrating the resurrection on a Sunday, which meant the crucifixion had to be on a Friday, regardless of the Jewish date. Victor was so infuriated by the Asian churches that he excommunicated them all. He cut off entire communities of Christians. Darian: over a date? Over a calendar dispute? Tim: it was not a calendar dispute. It was a battle over which gospel was telling the truth. Rome was defending the synoptic timeline. Asia Minor was defending John's timeline. They were excommunicating each other because the Bible they were reading contained an irreconcilable contradiction, and they had to pick a side. Malcolm: the early Christians knew the timelines did not match. They did not try to harmonize them with mental gymnastics about Roman time versus Jewish time. They recognized the contradiction, they fought over it, and eventually the Roman Church won. They established the Sunday celebration of Easter, and the Quartodecimans were branded as heretics. Darian: so the church just picked a winner and suppressed the other side. Tim: yes, but they kept both Gospels in the Bible. They kept the contradiction right there in the text and just stopped talking about it. For centuries, the church relied on the fact that ordinary people could not read the texts for themselves, let alone place them side by side to compare the timelines. Malcolm: it worked for over a millennium. The seamless narrative held until the Enlightenment, until scholars started looking at the Bible not as a divine object, but as a book with a history. Malcolm: and this is precisely where Baruch Spinoza enters the picture. Long before Bart Ehrman or Raymond Brown, Spinoza saw the exact same fractures in the text. In his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, published in 1670, Spinoza laid down a revolutionary method for reading the Bible. He argued that we must treat the biblical text exactly as we would treat any other historical document. We must not assume divine perfection. We must examine the history of its transmission, the context of its authors, and above all, its internal contradictions. Darian. But surely Spinoza was focusing on the Old Testament. The Torah? Tim. He started there. He proved that Moses could not have written the entire Pentateuch because it contains accounts of Moses' own death and burial. But the method applies universally. Spinoza argued that when two biblical accounts contradict each other on fundamental historical facts, both cannot be historically true, but both can reveal the human agendas of their respective authors. Malcolm Spinoza realized that the text was a product of human hands, compiled over generations, heavily edited, and shaped by political and theological necessity. When you apply Spinoza's lens to the Passion Week, the contradiction between John and the Synoptics is not a crisis of faith. It is a piece of forensic evidence. It proves that the Gospel of John was written by someone who prioritized theological symbolism over historical accuracy. Darian. It makes sense. It intellectually makes sense. But emotionally, it feels like the ground is falling away. If John changed the day of the crucifixion, what happens to biblical inerrancy? Tim. It dies. The doctrine of biblical inerrancy cannot survive the Gospel of John, because either Jesus ate the Passover meal or he did not. He cannot have been crucified both on Friday the 15th of Nisan and on Thursday the 14th of Nisan. The timelines are completely incompatible. Malcolm. And the lengths to which people will go to ignore this are staggering. I have seen scholars bend themselves into absolute knots. They invent entirely new ancient calendars that no one has ever heard of, just to explain away the 24-hour gap. They suggest Jesus held a secret early Passover meal. They propose that Galileans calculated days differently from Judeans. Tim. Anything to avoid the obvious truth. The author of John had a pen, he had a theological agenda, and he rewrote the history to fit it. He wanted Jesus to be the Passover lamb, so he made him die when the lambs died. End of story. Darian. Wait, I need to process this. You are saying the entire concept of Jesus as the Lamb of God, the concept that has defined Christian atonement theology for 2,000 years, is based on an intentional historical falsification? Tim. I am saying that the author of John constructed a narrative to support that theology, and he was willing to break the timeline of the other three Gospels to do it. Malcolm. And remember what you said at the very beginning of this conversation? That the timeline of the Last Supper is what every church in the world teaches. That this is what everyone learns. Tim. They learn it because that is the exact function of the Orthodox narrative. It is not designed to inform you about history. It is designed to control the theological message you receive. Darian, I cannot refute that. I came into this conversation thinking I knew how to defend the text, that there was some neat, harmonious explanation I just had not learned yet, but there isn't. I do not have a way to defend this, and honestly, I do not want to try anymore. The evidence is just too overwhelming. Malcolm, if this realization feels heavy, you are not alone. There is an unspoken exhaustion that comes with attempting to pound the biblical text to fit preconceived ideas of perfection. Tim, It is spiritually exhausting because you are constantly fighting the text itself. The text wants to tell you it has contradictions. You are the one forcing it to be perfect. Malcolm. If you are ready to stop forcing the text to be something it is not, and you want to understand how deep these historical fractures really go, I have made something for you. The honest truth is that this channel does not make money anymore. YouTube demonetized it 2 months ago, but the research continues. I have compiled 3 years of research into the Spinoza Archive Library. It is 5 volumes detailing everything from the timeline of deception to what the early church actively suppressed. It is not a donation. It is an archive. Every source is verifiable. You can find the link in the pinned comment. If this research has meant something to you, that is where you can find the rest of it. Darian. So where does this leave us? If the text is managed, if the history is rewritten, what do we do with the Gospels? Tim. We read them for what they are. Human documents, written by men with agendas in a specific time for a specific audience. Malcolm. We stop demanding that they be divine dictation. Spinoza proved that they cannot be both divine and contradictory. But in their humanity, they are fascinating. They show us how early Christian communities fought over the meaning of Jesus' death. John's community needed a Passover lamb. Mark's community needed an apocalyptic martyr. They wrote the histories they needed. Darian. I entered this conversation with a certainty about the text. I am leaving with a completely different view. And the second one, the honest one, is better. Because it means I can stop pretending. The gospel authors did not record history. They constructed theology. Malcolm. And once you see the construction, you can never unsee it. If this conversation helped you see it, subscribe to the channel. It tells the algorithm that this kind of unvarnished historical debate has value and ensures you will be here when we publish the next one, because we have many more layers to peel. Tim, we have barely scratched the surface. Malcolm, I want to hear from you now. Which voice convinced you? Were you taught the harmonious timeline growing up? And when did you first realize the dates did not match? Comment below. The conversation continues there.
If you know someone still trapped in religious fear, someone who needs to know the historical truth, share this with them, anonymously if you have to. Sometimes one video changes everything.